Hello and welcome to NIGP's Learning Lab. Today's session is Find Opportunities, Practice the Art of Question, hosted by Richard Pennington. Richard has over 35 years of experience in public procurement law and leadership in the U.S. Air Force and state government, 7 years of which was in private law practice. He helps in development and facilitation of NIGP's Pathways courses. Richard is co-author of the 3rd edition of the Legal Aspects of Public Procurement and author of Seeing Excellence, Learning from Great Procurement Teams. Richard, would you like to go and get us started?
As Justin mentioned, I'm Richard Pennington. I'm going to have a conversation today. We're going to do something that I discovered probably 15 or 20 years ago. Maybe you all have figured this out already, and that is the importance of questions. Questions in facilitating meetings, questions in relating to people in your teams. We'll use a simple little exercise initially just to get you used to turning questions into effective questions. We'll talk about what that means a little bit this afternoon. I'm going to have you develop or start to develop what I call an opportunity summary to start thinking about recasting often what we call problems into the positive when you're dealing with clients. I've used this for almost 20 years now and found it effective. And I'll share that with you and let you see kind of how that works. I'll let you also look, some of you have strategic planning experience, and we'll contrast that with the typical SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats that some of you maybe have been exposed to in strategic planning. But you know what? Questions are still central to all of this, and we're going to see a great example of that out of the city of Longmont, Colorado. It was a citywide transformation initiative that I got to sort of at the tail end of. We'll get those insights as well as some later insights and through her career progression from Danielle Hintz, who is with us now, is going to stay with us for the 2 hours, and she and I'll have a conversation, and hopefully we get some questions from you all about her experiences. I showcase Danielle as what I call a lateral leader, although she's led large organizations also, and I think what you're going to hear her do is pretty much validate my belief that questions are really the key to so much success in teams, in leadership, really in life in terms of using them effectively. Danielle came from the city of Longmont, smaller contracts and purchasing office there. That's where I met her. She then moved on to a position as Chief Procurement Officer in King County, Washington, and more recently is now with the Amazon Business Public Sector, working probably more in a traditional team capacity rather than a large organizational organization that she's led. So welcome, Danielle. She's got some great insight on this. So with that, let's start. I once heard somebody say that a wise grandmother told them that God gave them 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And I'm not going to downplay the fact that listening is such an important part of what we're going to talk about today. We're not going to talk about the science of listening. I'd rather talk a little bit more about some of the practical things that you can use in this learning lab environment and even practice about asking questions. But listening has got to be part of it. And I think we're going to hear that a little bit from Danielle in terms of the project she had and one of the tactical choices she made in her transformation initiative that sort of ties into that theory. But Peter Sang, who's one of my favorite authors, wrote a book called The Fifth Discipline about organizational learning, had this quote and this caveat, which is balance advocacy, what you're trying to do to persuade people, to advocate, to influence people, with just pure inquiry, asking questions, trying to understand. That's the question, or the key part to a question really is, are you listening? I love this quote out of 2 authors that Danielle is familiar with. They have written about a technique called the power of or appreciative inquiry. But this is a great summary of when you're asking questions or speaking in any way, realize that the person that's listening they're trying to assess whether you're sincerely curious, whether you're empathetic to their needs, and you really want to learn. I mean, it's the whole idea of curiosity. So good thing to tuck away, I think. So what is this thing about a question? You know, it's funny, I was trained as an attorney, and we were trained on the art of cross-examination. And I've probably used this inadvertently on some of you. Things like, isn't it true that this is going to be an exciting webinar? Isn't it true that you always use questions when you engage other people in meetings? You know, that's a question, but it's not what we really call a open-ended question, which is the type of questions that really elicits some kind of response. It gets people engaged in terms of getting into the learning space and in the marketplace of ideas, trying to share with other people. And I especially think this is important when you're talking to client agencies. I mean, just coming in with pointed questions that you're trying to lead people to a specific answer on often is not going to get you where you need to be. So when we see these types of courses for lawyers, I ask when I see and this is an actual one on a continuing legal education program, advanced cross-examination techniques, just think of some of these things, a little hard maybe to read, but training people to say yes, forming questions to achieve control, you know, allowing people to see your points, controlling really what they're going to say. You've probably heard on law programs, people say, never ask a question that you don't know the answer to. Bad advice when you're in an organizational setting, in a leadership setting. Great for lawyers. And then I did some criminal practice, and I had occasional success doing this. But an open-ended question is really a different sort of animal. And I chose these because they're the ones that they commonly come up in team settings, even larger organizational settings. And you'll see them asked this way sometimes, but there is a little art into trying to change these a little bit so they get some open responses. So with that, we're going to take our first shot at the breakout room. Let's go ahead and just do a few of these from group one. Are you satisfied with the purpose that we've drafted in the charter?
One suggestion was just replacing those first pieces with using the word what. So what is satisfactory in the purpose that we've drafted in this charter. So just a simple change of the leading words in there to what. Okay.
Did you talk about how would you change the purpose if you had to do it again? I mean, that's one way to get people thinking too about looking back on something, but that's a good one. I'll just highlight this for folks. This was a couple ideas on the second one. Do you have a clear picture of success? How do you measure success? What does success look like to you? That's an open-ended question. Like this one, did the meeting meet your expectations? What did you come up with there?
Just changing the opening paragraph to asking more specifically, not did it meet your expectations, but what specific topics or areas did you find productive?
And we had this one. Are you going to be done on time? Somebody from our group.
What is the real problem as opposed to just time? What's
time? Yeah. Okay. And you know, that's a great point. Often you'll see questions like this. They're disguising what the real concern is underneath. I think that's a great point. So, are the performance measures improving? Which is a yes or no response. But how much a read? Did you get to that one?
We did, and by asking what are the performance measures improving, what is that benchmark? What are they improving by?
Okay.
just adding a little more detail into there.
You should see a quote now by David Cooper Writer that kind of goes the next step here. And that is, just asking open-ended questions is one thing, but achieving an objective with them is another. And I think this is a great quote. I mean, once you ask the question, you've started a process of change. I mean, you really have. And just think about it. Now, I saw this big time in the city of Longmont, which is a town it's about 40 miles north of Denver, and they had done city planning, but they had accelerated their growth by about 10 years in terms of what they expected. And in education, in use of green space in the downtown area that was sort of dying at the time. And they brought together a consultant. The mayor's office had a woman that was really instrumental in all of this to bring in people. And it was a process called Appreciative Inquiry. And what it's designed to do is to use positive questions as a way to kind of reframe problems that are being formed in a positive way and make it more optimistic. And what they did is they brought in the consultants, they trained a bunch of people because they really were going to talk to groups in the city. I think when I read the story, finally, it was over 500 people they engaged, and they trained people because of the size of it. They needed some help. Danielle, we're going to have a conversation with here in a minute, was one of the ones trained. And they would go out, and after they had chosen the topics, the appreciative topics, and they were broadly framed around the graphic imagery here. This is what they call graphic recording that the Department of Community Services used. But they were looking at the downtown area and education and housing, and how do they promote diversity, but also how do they protect the environment. And that had been really what they had been proud of all those years. And they got the people in rooms in large groups and asked a series of questions that Danielle finally turned into a series of appreciative questions to engage stakeholders in procurement. When the city did this, procurement wasn't in the mix. There was a subsequent reorganization, and the new leadership came in and looked at Danielle and said, along with others, and said, we want you to look at your processes. What's broken and what can you fix and how you do it. And she was actually, as she told me when I talked with her first about this, now it's been 8 or 9 years ago, she was a little bit panicked about it because she didn't know where to start. And they actually started with, I think she said they got 50 stakeholders together for a 2-hour session. And what they needed was a little bit more structure to how they engage some of the stakeholder and client agencies to ask these kinds of questions. And these were them. I mean, what was the experience in the past with procurement that really you worked well? And what do we learn now from this? And if you had to envision what the system would be like if it were perfect, what would that be? When I came and I got wind of this, a lot of this had been done already. They'd focused on contracting, procurement and solicitations. As I recall, the procurement card program was being talked about, construction, and the procurement code. And being a lawyer, we had the model procurement code at the state level. And I had been around myself some terrible experiences with opening that up because I had well-intentioned ideas to open up the procurement code until we went to the General Assembly. And I remember one time the first question out of the representative's mouth that we were approaching was, why are we awarding all these contracts to out-of-state vendors? And we took our little book and we thanked the representative for his time. We acknowledged he probably had more important things. We sort of left because our little modest problem we thought was going to turn into a lot more. Well, I was thinking about that when Danielle told me the story, and I went and logged in to the public hearing when she presented the procurement code that was based after the model procurement code. I had my snacks. I was ready for a 3-hour bloodbath about how this was going to turn out. And I think in about 20 minutes, she had presented it, summarized it, opened it for questions. There might have been one softball question, if at all, and they passed it. You know, I mean, I was just struck, and that's why the whole idea of the way she engaged stakeholders and asked these questions of people, and got to some real success in the transformation through the use of questions like this really I was awestruck by it. So I had to have the lateral leader, who is Danielle, come here and talk with you about that and other things that she's done. And what I'd like you to do is talk with them about our discussion that we had, Danielle. One was your tactical way that you, when you got into this questioning, how you kind of structured that with your colleague. And then the other is what you did with your office to solve the fear problems.
So it's great to be here with you. Richard set it up very well. I guess for a little bit more context that I would throw in is I did go through the facilitator training in this particular style, which is Appreciative Inquiry, which the whole idea is, rather than just soliciting feedback, it's really about like figuring out what people like about what currently exists. And then this question around what would it be if it were perfect is really, the authors describe it as kind of this like dreaming or visioning exercise, right? Like not just sort of cutting them off by what is practical to expect if it were to go well, but really like open your mind, think big. Like if no rules applied, basically, right? Like what could it look like? What would it look like if it were absolutely perfect? So, and the concept around asking that first question about what do you like about what currently exists, and Richard had those questions up on the screen, but you can plug and play whatever. Essentially, the question is, what do you like about what's happening now, or what do you appreciate about what's happening now? The idea of asking that question is so that they can tell you what's working well, right? Like people tend to focus a lot on what's not working. So they will give you the laundry list of everything that is not working right now. But to really get them to focus on, we know there's some goodness in everything. Tell us what is working well now. Two, what that also helps as you move forward with the feedback that you've gotten, you know what not to get rid of. In the group that I worked with always said, like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm sure you've all heard that saying, right? Like, don't get rid of everything just because you're trying to fix some things. And so having folks tell you what's actually working well at the time helps you know what to preserve and even what to accentuate, right? So we knew some things were already going well. People liked feedback that we were giving them, they liked one-on-one attention, whatever the case may be. So we knew what to keep in our processes. And then when we asked, what would it be if it were perfect? Rather than saying, hey, what would you change? And again, getting that laundry list of everything they hate about what's happening right now, rather like, what would it be in your mind if we were to develop the perfect thing? And what that does, what we found in our process is people had a lot of appreciation for what our constraints were, right? So one of the areas that we got feedback on was the purchasing code, as Richard said. People really understood that in public procurement, you need to have that accountability. You need to have constraints that somewhat regulate the procurement process that you go through, even though they don't like it, right? They still understand that you have to have some framework within which you operate. And that really came out in this exercise by asking these questions. So the fact that they said, hey, we like the fact that we feel we can defend the way our taxpayers' money is spent by the fact that we have these procurement regulations. Like, imagine your stakeholders telling you that, right? Like, it was just powerful to hear. And then we also got and here's what it would be if it were perfect, right? Like, we want more consistency among thresholds. We want higher thresholds. My staff, the staff in the purchasing office was like, you're going to ask our stakeholders for feedback about what we do? Are you crazy? And you can tell them, no, it'll be fine. Trust me, it'll be fine. Actually ran the exercise with our purchasing staff first. So we asked them these exact same questions that then we went out and asked the stakeholders for. And then the other trick that we used is we actually asked each of the purchasing staff to be involved in that session where we got feedback from the stakeholders, and we put them as note takers. We told them no talking, right? Like, you don't get to argue, you don't get to say yeah, but, or, you know, try to give context for the issues. You are a note taker, which means you're writing down what people say. And so it helped for them to feel involved so that they were in the room, they knew what was being said, there was no filtering that they you know, knew would be happening by me or anyone else in terms of the feedback that they got or that we were getting. So, so they were involved. They, at the end of that, their feedback was, you know, they were so happy to be involved. And quite honestly, we got a ton of appreciation in that room from our stakeholders, like I said, for our roles, the things that we were doing, which was awesome for them to hear. And then for them to hear, like, what do people really want for us to change? And it's just more powerful, I think, for folks to hear from their stakeholders, the people that they're working with day in and day out, to get them through these processes on how they want it improved, gives them more buy-in to actually change the process or to improve the thing going forward. So yeah, we asked about all these areas. We had a lot of great feedback. The staff was super involved. Overall, it was a really positive experience. I had been struggling to make changes to the code for like 3 years prior to this. And, you know, as purchasing manager, sitting in a room, redlining your code to make changes for what you think is right, even if you're referring to model procurement code or something else, is really complicated. And then how do you vet that with stakeholders? So it really shifted the conversation to get that feedback from stakeholders and use that to, you know, really figure out what to change in the code. And as Richard said, it was no problem getting it through council because they knew the process that we had gone through to get to where we were when we took it to them. So it really made that approval process really pretty simple.
And I think what I'd like you to do is talk about the 5 whys. When you and I spoke about this, I mean, if the 5 whys is a way for all of you to get back at children, because, you know, we always told them when they asked us why, because, and now there's actually a tool in continuous improvement called 5 whys. Tell us a little bit about that context for when you were in King County, what that continuous improvement kind of process look like and how 5 whys fit into that.
Yeah, so when I went to King County, there was a huge initiative that the division I was going into, which was finance and business operations. They were going through this huge project to improve all their processes, really with the outcome of needing to reduce costs out to the departments for all the services that we provided to them. So I came in kind of midway into that effort, and they were using lean principles. So not really, you know, Six Sigma, a little bit modified version, but just kind of pure lean practices. So looking for waste, removing those from the processes. But one thing that they focused on and they trained to was to ask why 5 times. So in order to improve a process, they think you really have to start with a clearly defined problem. And in order to clearly define the problem, you have to understand what the root cause of that problem is. And so to get to the root cause of the problem, you have to ask why 5 times, right? So if you say, you know, tell me why this process isn't working for you. Well, the rules say that we have to do it this way. Well, why do the rules say to do it that way? Well, because the council said that that's the way it is and there's a statute. Okay, well, you know, why is that? And so like really continuing to ask why gets you down to what the root cause of the problem is. Now I'll tell you in practice, it's not always 5, right? Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 7. But you know, 5 whys, like keep asking why so that you can really understand where the problem is coming from.
You know, one thing that intrigued me when you moved into the larger, I think you said you had about 55 people in your organization when you went to King County, much larger than Longmont. But you mentioned that just when we spoke a couple of days ago, you found a place for appreciative questions as you started that process in a new organization. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So yeah, going in cold to this organization that I knew, you know, had a ton of history And I was walking into this role where I was expected to quickly, make an impact on process improvement and employee morale. I was actually talking to the assistant city manager that I worked for before I left Longmont, and I said, gosh, I just, I don't even know where to start. And she's like, use appreciative inquiry. Why wouldn't you do that? Ask all your staff these 3 questions. And so, genius moment. So total credit goes to Sandy Cedar for giving me this feedback. So within my first 30 days, I met with all of my staff one-on-one, and I asked them those 3 questions. I said, what do you appreciate about working here right now? What could I change if it, to make it perfect? And then what else do you want me to know? So those were the 3 questions I asked all of them one-on-one. In addition to just kind of starting with an earn trust moment, right, to sit one-on-one with staff that, didn't feel like they had that kind of attention from senior leadership was a big moment anyway. But then the feedback that I got totally helped me to find themes and to really focus my efforts over the first 90 days, first 6 months, first year of my time there, and make really impactful changes for the employees based on the feedback that I had gotten directly from them. And about 6 months after joining, accounts payable joined my org as well. And so I actually did the same thing with them, asked the same 3 questions, did exactly the same thing with them. And to the day I left, it was something that the staff said they really appreciated about what I did as I came on board to that new organization.
Oh, that's
And I don't
cool.
think it's something you have to do when you join new. I think, if you've been with an organization for a while and are looking to just kind of mix things up, especially in these crazy times, probably just a great way if you meet with your staff one-on-one or whatnot to, embed those questions in where you can.
You went from King County 55 person organization, then with Amazon, and you're I call you a lateral leader now. You're in a more traditional team environment. How do questions, are they still relevant? Do you use questions in your everyday practice now, even there and in Amazon?
Yeah, for sure. In a couple different ways. One is, Amazon prides itself on being extremely customer obsessed, which honestly is one of the reasons I felt comfortable joining the company. They really design from the customer and work backwards from there. And that was something I felt like I was trying to employ even in my public procurement days. So how you do that is to really understand what the customer wants or needs in order to be successful. And that is by asking questions, right? There's a ton of questions that need to get asked. I've learned a lot about sales strategy. I'm not in the sales org, but I work with them. And so I understand that their work is completely based around asking questions of customers to really understand what their environment is and how, what their problems are and how we can best fix them. And then when it comes time to work within Amazon across the teams that can then really build these solutions and bring them to fruition for the customer, asking a lot of questions just to dig deeper is very important. And actually, we have leadership principles that are so embedded in the culture here at Amazon, and one of them is to learn and be curious. And it's all bounded within this idea of you have to ask a lot of questions. And even as leaders, you're not allowed to operate only at a high level. You have to also dig into the details to understand what's really happening so that you can drive impactful change.
Cool. Curiosity, I think, is a great word to capture that whole sort of approach to this, is trying to be curious when you ask people things. So
I would ask if, did you employ it any one time? And I haven't looked at Appreciative Inquiry, but I read about it here in Richard's book, kind of the what should we stop, what should we start, those questions with staff. I guess, where did you go with the next level?
Yeah, we did this whole exercise, and I have this very vivid memory being in this huge conference room, and on one entire wall they had papers hanging up, and you had to they did it as Post-it notes, right? So all the things that we should stop doing in order to further our mission, which things should we start doing, and then the things that we should continue. I think that's super effective too. I did it when I went to King County as well. I think there's a time and a place for it, right? And I think it's as you say, it's after you ask those initial questions and then you kind of figure out, okay, now where do we need to go? Because the start, stop, continue gets more granular, I would say, than kind of, the bigger kind of concepts, and really asks for people to think about what tasks are we doing or not doing that are either helping or hurting where we're trying to go, right? So if this is the vision, how do we get there? And so which things do we need to stop doing, start doing, or continue doing in order to help support that?
Thanks, Danielle. Anybody else?
I do. I loved your design it from the customer viewpoint, which might have been easier to do both at King County and Longmont. But when you get to something as big as Amazon, do you have a consistent customer viewpoint, or do you have to take the majority rules? And I kind of asked that from a Sourcewell cooperative stance. I mean, I can listen to one customer say, we're so glad that you do multiple awards because we have different departments who are brand specific. And then I can have someone, same vertical, county procurement officer, say, we really don't believe in multiple awards. And I'm kind of like, how do I get, so what did you do with probably Amazon?
Yeah, so at Amazon, it's interesting. Huge company, of course, lots of customers, but they really tend to zero in on insights that come up from customers. And we have this whole tracking system called Voice of Customer. And that's where any feedback that we get from customers, anybody can log into this system. And then as we're developing something new or enhancing something existing, we look at those insights to figure out what to do. I think when it comes to, you get conflicting opinions at Amazon, what we have the ability to do, which is not the case everywhere, but we really try to build flexible systems that can scale across multiple customers. So our teams are really good at, how can we make this work for, this side spectrum case as well as this side spectrum case, right? So a lot of the things that we offer are sort of options that you can use if you need to, right? Like, I think the one example I would call out is, people will say any purchasing on Amazon would have to be approved, by a supervisor. And we have other organizations that's like, it's small dollar spend, we don't want any approvals, right? And so how do you build to that? Well, you build that as an option that people can either configure or not on their Amazon business account. I think, in my past life, what I would say is that when we have those conflicts, if you can kind of gut check it, use either a legal or a kind of best practice backing to make your decision. Or, in that case, you kind of just have to go with majority rule, right? And, what's going to serve the most customers the best. I was a debater in high school, and I always did these value debates, right? So the greater good was always a driving value. And so I still believe that today, that you have to take the greater good to make your decisions as you move forward. So, it's a democracy, I guess, right?
I liked a couple things, Danielle, that you referenced. I think starting with asking them what works really works to create sort of a customer-centric experience and spin the discussion. But I really like the sharing the information about having someone from the procurement team sit in just as a note taker to not speak, but to hear from the customer's perspective more than just over an email or a short phone call, what's working and then what's not working. And so, that feedback, that unfiltered, unbiased feedback, and then having to document really speaks volumes and probably gets a lot more engagement than a bazillion webinars or coaching sessions. So that's a really good suggestion. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Great point. Great discussion. The term why is a funny word because you probably need to be a little sensitive, at least in my experience. It can seem a little challenging to people, a why. So the way the 5 whys is set up, there's a real reason for it. Sometimes trying to soften that, I like help me understand. That is a softer way than just why, because sometimes that's a little off-putting for people. this one is one that I've actually seen used in a meeting. How will we know we succeeded? It gets you to the question of purpose. We talked about that in our last learning lab. Also, really measurement and whether you're going to do quantitative measurement and that sort of analysis or what types of that you're going to do. How do we know we succeeded? You know, now what? I mean, at some point, this is kind of related, I think, to Lisa's question. At some point, after you've got the vision established, there are some tangible, practical things you need to do. And just in a meeting, trying to say, after we get those mind expansion questions, at some point somebody asks in a team, so what now? I mean, what happens now? I think is an effective question. What information is needed by stakeholders? I mean, what do you need to get them? This used to happen to me when I did legal reviews on contracts in the Attorney General's office. I could tell them it wasn't good enough, that it was rejected, but I also needed to let them know what they needed to do in order to fix it. And second, even more important, do I give them enough information so the next time they're able internally to know that it's going to be a problem in terms of the routing process? That's a process issue, and that's information, or how do you, what is needed? I mean, the question that goes with that with a client is, what do you need from me? I mean, in terms of information, especially if things are breaking down, if you're having problems with processes and the adequacy of information you're getting, like an RFP drafts or statements of work. What do you need for me to help you do that better? I mean, what aren't you getting from me? And I think it's an important question. I always thought that not everything is measured, and sometimes I've actually seen when you study benchmarking, people say that the most important things really are not quantitatively measured. It's in many respects, but we're in a metric world, and how do you assess the value of things that people want to measure in terms of whether it's worth the time and effort? I always like this question. I saw this in a question by a man named Douglas Hubbard, I believe was his name, and which is, what do we do? What measurements help reduce the uncertainty in decision making? I mean, isn't that ultimately what we're trying to achieve, is give people the information that they need to make decisions? I'm going to tell you just a couple little stories now that I uncovered. One is in the book. One was done in a government procurement article about 3 years ago. This one was in the book, the city of Port Lucie. And what was, well, it started really, I think, with the first downturn. The first downturn happened in 2002. I think they called it the dot-com collapse. And I was caught in that as a new division director in my division. I had to have layoffs, and we were having revenue problems, and I think a lot of other governments were at the time. Port St. Lucie was, and they had applied for a neighborhood stabilization grant. It was either then or after the 2005 crunch. They were having a lot of vacancies, a lot of foreclosures, a lot of blighted neighborhoods, and frankly, their facilities department was in danger of mass layoffs because they weren't doing any construction, and they needed to kind of keep them busy. And so what the Department of Community Services did is applied for a neighborhood stabilization grant from the federal government, $13.5 million. They set up a team of consisting of facilities, community services, and the Office of Management and Budget that controlled their procurement function. Had a series of supplier meetings by people in the community. I think they had a 75 eventually that did work on renovation of properties, and sat down and said, what do we need to do to spend this money quickly in order to get these homes in a condition that we can sell them? Because what they did is they went out and bought the properties. They bought these blighted homes. They had them inspected. They went out with statements of work for these pre-qualified vendors, and these vendors or suppliers, as I prefer to call them, went in on a short phased task order response, which was a modified IFB, invitation for bids, and came in and bid on it. And they had to do it this way because they had limited time to use the money in terms of its availability for this particular grant. A couple of things from a risk perspective. One was they really waived their insurance requirements or throttled them way back, and because they were going to have a lot of small business, small supplier involvement in this, and they were trying to make it as non-onerous on some of the smaller renovation type of companies as they could. The other thing, which I thought was amazing, Cheryl Shannenberger was her name, that was in charge of this. And when I talked to her, this one blew me away, and that was they used procurement cards for doing cash advances. Whoa, that was a little bit brave. I mean, that's something that a lot of public entities aren't going to do. And she was able to get her entity to take the risk on that and assume that risk. Well, when they got through phase one, I think phase one was about 150 homes. They went out for phase two, which was going to be another 200, and a lot of the people weren't bidding. And they wondered why. And they did what you might have, or is known as an after-action review, or a post-action review by the team. And they asked themselves, and they invited in suppliers on this, and they asked themselves, what did we expect to have happen? Well, what they expected to have happened was this wild enthusiasm for phase two. And what they really found out was the suppliers hadn't been getting the work they expected. And what they found out also was the way the specs were being written for the renovations in these homes. People would bid on them, kind of thinking they knew what really needed to be done. And I kind of read between the lines on this, but some people exploited the specifications, kind of came in low, won the bids, and then over the course of the projects, they grew in size and scope and expense. And some of the people just weren't getting the work, and they didn't want to really participate anymore. Well, that was what actually happened of after action review, and they got a lot of insight into that by talking to suppliers. And what they learned about the reasons for it was that just what I mentioned is they had people writing specifications instead of relying on people that really kind of knew what it needed to make a house marketable and habitable. And they changed their philosophy and involved the building inspectors who really went into homes more and approved small construction type projects in the city, and to be involved in the requirements definition. And they started having really quick turnaround on-site project meetings, so people could see the property, see what condition it was in, and get a better feel. And they, as a result of that, got a lot more interest in that community from not only this project and the 200 remaining homes that they did, but for the future. What they learned, they actually engaged suppliers in a way they'd never done before. There was a lot of fear in the office about this kind of an interaction broadly with industry in this quick of a period, looking at risk, trying to make adjustments to process. And when you talk to them, they really gained a better appreciation for the importance of talking to suppliers. Port St. Lucie, it's a great story about the use of questions really in a process called an after-action review that really helped them solve a crisis. The other one I found about 4 years ago. I used to be a member of NPI, National Procurement Institute, and they have the Achievement of Excellence in Procurement Award. And one cool thing about that one, that is one that is similar to the one that NIGP has, that was called the OA4, now is the Quality in Public Procurement Departments Award. This AEP award, they put representative
what they consider best practices responses on their award applications on their website. And I was able to go in to that, and I was looking around one day to find out a little bit about mentoring. It'd been something I'd been interested in, and I happened to look at the Cobb County School District application, and I learned a few things about them. They're outside of Atlanta, Georgia. They had got the Pareto Award, the highest award in NIGP. It's really the penultimate award. It's modeled after the Malcolm Baldrige Quality Award that the federal government has. Really a great achievement. I think they had 6 OA4 NIGP awards, and I think they'd done 12 years in a row of the AEP. So they were wired. And I looked at their write-up on their professional development, and what struck me was they used the term mentoring in their professional development. And I went in and talked to Barbara Bates, the deputy for procurement, about what she meant by that. I mean, what she meant by the term mentoring, and in the context of that. And because I knew about onboarding. I mean, I knew I've been the victim of onboarding many times. Usually they handed me a manual, said, here, go read this, you know, and then you have all these questions, you know, don't know who to go talk to about it. And what their approach was when somebody came in new, and the example she gave me was somebody that came out of a county that had procurement experience but never had been done in a school district. And so one of the first questions they'd ask is, you know, what is your experience? They'd assess that probably as part of the interview process and try to figure out maybe where the gaps were. And they handed them the book. I mean, the book was the policies, the district policies, and their templates, and they knew where the website was, and those things to really familiarize themselves. But they did a couple other things. One was they put an Excel spreadsheet together that had the names of people in the office along with topics like RFPs, IFPs, small purchase limits, use of cooperatives, those things that we all have to deal with, requisitions. But sometimes it's better to sit down with somebody. And Barbara said she was selective on this because some people are better at things than others. And then she would put the names. And the idea was the people in the office were expected to sit down and spend time on these topics. Did this happen in a week? No. She said this was months before they actually got through this process. But there was a mentoring aspect. One of the ones would be they would ask the new person, would you be willing to review my work and make comments? And they had that kind of environment, which not all offices do, but seasoned people that are willing to let somebody look at it, you know, and then people feel compelled to read it and then maybe ask some questions, but it starts the dialogue. And how about joining me in a pre-bid meeting? Take somebody along to go see how they did that in an office. Great question to ask in a mentoring way, a facilitative way when you're trying to do some onboarding. And then I saw one of their agendas at one of their staff meetings. They sent somebody to forum, I think it was, that and that person came back, and the expectation was they would sit down after that, or maybe a webinar or something, and just do a brief 10 or 15 minute presentation to the office about what it was about, what they learned, maybe, and have a discussion. I mean, that is a mentoring environment that really involves a facilitative use of questions to engage people in ways to help them learn. I thought it was a terrific story. This one, I've given you the site here. It's in Government Procurement Magazine in April, May of 2017, onboarding and mentoring. I love the what if question. I mean, this is the one I used when I was in a new division. We had 3 different offices that were all put together. Didn't have much in common. We had architects, attorneys, debt collectors, procurement professionals, and accountants. We had one thing in common. Our clients pretty much all hated us because of our policies. So we rallied around that. But what if was, you know, well, we can't do that. You know, that's against the fiscal rules. Well, what if we can find the authority to do a waiver and a small pilot on 2 representative departments? What if we do that? What's the worst that can happen? Use what if. I mean, it's a great way, I think, in a team environment to get people thinking about the future and possibilities. I'm not sure if I went to an executive staff meeting, I would be the first one to ask this question of my department director. But this is a great question to ask your teams if you're ever leading a team or you're ever facilitating a team meeting. I suggest people rotate agenda facilitations or development. Let people have practice with that. I think as a leader, that's a good one. What do you think is the most important thing we should be discussing today? I mean, a great question. Or when you're building the agenda, go to people that you know are going to be at the meeting. What should we be doing? Do you put question marks on your agenda? I was shocked the first time I ever suggested this, and somebody paused and they said, you know, I don't believe we do. And I'm just curious, shout out, why, what do you think putting a question mark on the agenda signifies? Anybody want to take a shot at what that might be? Has anybody ever done it?
Yeah, we do it very frequently with my leadership team meetings, and so we're looking for a collaborative solution.
Yeah,
We don't have an answer, but we're looking for input.
that's a great comment, Jody, because it does signal to people that they're actually looking for ideas. And now you'd want to make sure you send it out in advance. I mean, the worst thing to do is to do that and then pop it out 2 minutes before the meeting starts, so nobody's had a chance to think about it. But I think that's a great idea. Anybody else that has had been surprised if you put that on an agenda by the results? Think about it. I mean, it's you know, I was trained in the military. I was an Air Force officer and for 23 years, and I got wired into, you know, don't have meetings if you don't need them. If you have them, mindful of the time. I never really cared for here's the topic, we're going to spend 3 minutes. Here's the next topic, we're going to spend 1.5 minutes. I mean, it's like, okay, I'm here. I guess I'm here in a receiver mode now. I mean, and some meetings are that, they're informational, but think about the power of questions in meetings when you're really trying to get some ideas on the table. Danielle, any thoughts on that? I'm just curious on your meeting management because you've spanned different sort of organizations.
Yeah. I feel like meeting management is one of the most difficult things you do as a facilitator, whether you're the leader of a group, you know, a staff or whatever that you're leading that, or if you're facilitating an RFP committee or whatever. I just feel like that meeting facilitation is definitely a learned skill. And putting an agenda together that, you know, sort of gets people in the meeting ready to be engaged, I feel like is always a trick. And wish I would have talked to you earlier about this question mark idea, because I think that then tells people they have to come prepared to interact, right?
Yeah, and I've read some
like
studies that say people need at least about 30 minutes to engage their brains, and that's why it always bugged me when I didn't get agendas, and especially when it looked like it was going to be a fun topic because I wanted to think about it. But no, well, I understand that you probably have never used this because this took years of college education for me to come up with this idea. I'm just telling you. So
it was a law degree that did it, wasn't it?
It's a simple little idea. So thanks, Danielle.
You know, Richard, if I might, the one meeting facilitation tool that I did learn that I used and I thought was relatively successful is when I was trying to get input from staff. You know, you learn how the difference between introverts and extroverts, right? And those introverts oftentimes need, and I'm one, but oftentimes need some time to think. So you can't ask them a question and expect them to feel good about off the cuff responding. So the one thing that I would do is I would use those sticky easel pads, those big things, and give everybody post-it notes so they could write their ideas down. And then I would leave those hanging on the wall for a day or two or a week, kind of as long as maybe you can let it go, so that people have extended time to think about the question that you asked them and be able to give you their responses. If you have the time to do that, I would
That's a great
encourage
idea.
you to think about ways to weave that into
That's a
your
great idea.
meetings where you're getting feedback.
Have a sticky easel pad, and we're all working in a remote environment, but
Well, yeah, that's a
there
different
are
challenge, but
yeah, there are tools, and one of those is on Zoom. If you use Zoom, is the whiteboard, and that's a virtual tool. And I think there's others out there, but this is built in. The only tip is you need to save it. Danielle is what is in my book, is a lateral leader. She's one of the stars, and Some years ago, somebody asked me, Richard, if you had to summarize essential team leadership in easily, what would it be? And that's hard to ask a lawyer to do that, because I think in 20 bullets instead of 5. But questions really was one of the ones that came up. Practicing the use of questions in team leadership, and it is an art. And hopefully you're getting a little bit today in terms of some ideas on how to do that. I heard lead with your ears some years ago. I had used a version of this in my division when I started, but I had the offices asking each other the questions to start with, because they all knew me. And then I didn't have quite the urgency as Danielle to get it done that fast. But it's called Lead with Your Ears. Some great questions too. If you ever start a supervisory relationship or management relationship, think about using those as ways to start the dialogue. I think they're very effective. People like to be asked what they think, and I thought this was a great couple of quotes that I have here. This is a recent author. He's got probably 400 questions that I like the website. It doesn't start with the question or actually the answer. It really starts a journey, and I think great quote. So the final thing I'm going to just introduce quickly, this idea of opportunities. I thought Danielle did a great job illustrating or emphasizing what questions do like she asks. They reframe things, get you out of just the problem set, and get you thinking a little bit more about possibilities. And some years ago, I discovered the idea that if you frame things as problems all the time, then the solutions often just are framed the way the problem is, and you never get to the broader sort of visionary look at what you're trying to achieve, some of those purposes. The first time I used this was actually 18 years ago, and the idea was not to find the solutions for people, but to get them through a series of questions and what we thought in terms of answers. What some of the possible outcomes could be, and to be realistic with people about we're not pie in the sky here, and I am not the kind of person that I'm a pragmatist that believes that just because I announce a vision, it's all of a sudden we're going to get there. That I've done some thinking, or the team has done some thinking. I've used these most effectively in some national task force groups that I've led or been a part of, to be able to go out and recruit people and say, we'd like you to be a part of this, and here's what we call our initial opportunity summary, just to give you an idea of where this came from. What's a SWOT? Anybody want to break the curve and tell us what a SWOT is? Use it in strategic planning sometime.
Are you asking us to say strengths, weakness, opportunities, and threats? Is that the question?
That was a question. Look, she asked a question. Yes, I am. When you do strategic planning, it does that. But teams can do this too. And so oftentimes you're trying to look internally. You look at what are your strengths as a group. Sometimes that means you're going to call in somebody else. You may need somebody else to work on this. Sometimes if that's a weakness or something that you don't have that you need to have as a strength. The opportunities and threats tends to be in strategic planning, the external focus. Like, I know Lisa's in transit. I mean, does COVID give us an opportunity that didn't otherwise exist in terms of transportation for people in our district? Or what is the threat? Well, we're really having a tough time finding suppliers that are able to navigate this environment just because of the concerns. These are things that a team or an organization in a larger sense will go through in the planning process when they start looking at objectives and looking at tasks. But there's room to do it up front just to show people that this just wasn't a pie in the sky idea that nobody's thought about. And that was the purpose that we used to use this for. I've given you some of the kind of competing considerations that sometimes go on these things. that we would use. And so I'd kind of ask you when we get into this breakout just to tee that up and look at what I've got there. You might come up with others, competing considerations that are going to be on people's minds, especially stakeholders that may be a little bit nervous about even getting involved with something like this, but it at least shows that you're thinking about it. And it also is a way to record who's good on this stuff, who the interested people are that go on the team, or recommendations for the team. So that's what I call an opportunity summary. And we used it in Value Point for assessing a little bit different questions, but assessing good candidates for leading cooperatives, things like cloud and those things. And we had a fair amount of success. We had a discussion this morning, I heard in NASPO in their annual conference, and I heard the Office of Federal Procurement Policy speak, and I heard a representative from the National Governors Association speak, and it sort of validated what I put up here as a possible work group that you might be involved in leading or being a part of, that you're going to do an initial assessment of the opportunity and just try to be realistic about some of the competing considerations here. This one has to do with the need to pull together a work group to try to figure out how to provide information about allocation of PPE. Because the opportunities and threats and the strengths and weaknesses you'll look at organizationally in larger strategic planning, but I think it really works if you're trying to recruit people to a team. And it lets them know that you've done some thinking on this. We identified, for example, a great one was some people think they got this figured out. They'll just stockpile everything. They don't need to be on a coordination team. They'll just stockpile everything they need the next time the PPE comes along, and trying to get them to be part of it is hard. On the other hand, an opportunity it is for this kind of a work group for people to learn. I mean, if you got together on something like this, learn how the cooperatives like Duff's fit in, learn how the different states are doing it, how FEMA would work if we could get them involved. Great opportunity. We recognize that on the weaknesses side, us as a team, we didn't really have the knowledge we needed. I mean, my state procurement knowledge is 15 years old. We shared the problem of communication challenges.
And as you can tell, I sort of ended that in mid-sentence. Unfortunately, the internet gremlins reached up and grabbed us. We wanted to retain that last little breakout scenario because I think it's an important one in today's pandemic experience. And I'd invite you as a group to go ahead and share your thoughts on that final exercise. I'd like to thank Danielle Hinz for taking the time to share her insight and be with us. She's going to have a couple of sign-off remarks, including your email address here in a moment, but I'll just leave you with kind of the two main points of this webinar. Find opportunities and practice the art of the question.
I just say if any of you want to reach out to me, please do. I'm on LinkedIn, or my email is hinzd@amazon.com. Happy to have follow-up conversations with any of you. It was awesome to be here. So thanks so much for having me.